Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to get started regarding multidisciplinary perspectives in RTI. Okay, so to start, if we could go down the line and please give a brief introduction and your background.
Hi, my name is Ryan Farmer. I'm a school psychologist, and my specialty is in low-value practices and empirically supported treatments.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Christopher, or Beth Christopher, and I'm the statewide lead for Speech and Language Initiative here at Patton. And my specialty regarding this is systems change in speech pathology and looking at involving speech-language pathologists in more decision-making at the oral language level.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Erica Caruter from Patton Central, statewide lead for school psychology. I specialize in MTSS for math and also school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports.
Hello, my name is Dave Eddieburn. I'm a professor from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The expertise I bring to you today is assistive technology and universal design for learning.
Good afternoon. I'm Drew Hunter. I'm a professor at Millersville University and school psychologist by training. I guess my specialty is in multi-tiered systems of support. Specifically, I do a lot around response to intervention for the identification of specific learning disabilities.
Good afternoon. I'm Tim Runge, and consistent with three other colleagues up here, I'm a school psychologist. Apparently this is a school psychology convention. I'm a school psychologist by training and trade, was a practitioner for about 10 years. I've been teaching at Indiana University of Pennsylvania in a school psych program for the past 15 years, and ostensibly I'm here because I know some things about MTSS RTI, I would imagine.
Thank you. So we're very lucky to have this panel of experts today. And my name is Lydia Amy. I am an educational consultant out of Patton West, and by training I'm a school psychologist. Since we are considering multidisciplinary perspectives, I just want to get a little handle on who is in our audience. So do we have any special education teachers? Okay, school psychologists, speech language pathologists. Representing general education teachers. Okay, awesome. Administrators. Okay. Anyone else I'm forgetting? MTSS coordinator. Okay. School counselors. Assistive tech. All right. Okay, so let's get started. As I said, we'll go through a list of questions. I will show them on the screen. We might get off base a little bit, and that's okay. We want this to be a dialogue, and then at the end, we'll allow the opportunity for questions from you all. So we'll begin today's panel with some discussion on response to intervention as a multidisciplinary approach with stakeholders from various specialties working together on implementation. So Dr. Hunter, how do different areas of expertise, such as school psychology, special education, communication, and speech-language pathologists, general education teachers conceptualize RTI?
Okay, so I have to admit I was a bit puzzled by this question.
It's a loaded question.
Yeah, I would hope that we all have the same conceptualization of RTI, right? That way we're all on the same page. And by RTI, we're referring to MTSS, right? Like the framework versus the, I'm sorry, I'll answer it that way.
We're probably we're doing what we said in the last panel, right?
Okay, so.
Let's go with MTSS.
What I, as a school psychologist, so other school psychs, you can kind of concur with me or not. When I conceptualize MTSS, it's about resource allocation to maximize student outcomes, right? All right, so if in that vein, like I said, I would hope that all of us are kind of seeing MTSS in that role too. And then as I thought about the question a little bit more, I'm like, well, maybe it's about all of our different roles in MTSS. And then as I thought about that, I was like, no, we should all have the same role, right? But just maybe a different emphasis. So as a general education teacher in an MTSS system, you should be knowledgeable about effective instructional practices, but you also need to know how to administer assessments, interpret assessments, analyze data, all that. That may not be the main amount of thing that you'd spend doing. That might be where I spend more of my time, but I too also need to know about effective interventions and supports. So I guess I'm hoping that we're all seeing it as the same way. I have a feeling that maybe some people do conceptualize it a little differently. Like, I may or may not have worked with some individuals who saw MTSS as hoops that they needed to jump through to get a student what they wanted. But I think, again, I think that's maybe more about how that was implemented in that particular place versus what we all should be conceptualizing MTSS as. It's like, anyone, any other backgrounds up here? Want to add into that?
I will add.
From the SLP background?
You're going to keep looking at Dave and I guess, the whole time. So from an SLP background, when we're in graduate school, we are taught a little differently on the RTI model. But I do agree with Drew, and the reason why I'm here, and Tammy was here before, is we need to speak the same language. So that was going to be my response to a question I had later, is we need to come to terms in our own systems as to what it means to us and our networks. And in graduate school, sometimes we're referred to RTI as a service delivery model. And that is not how the system should work, I guess. I might be speaking out of turn there. But so we need to talk as a system in the districts or the LEAs that you're sitting in as to what does this mean to us, how does our system work, and our SLP needs to be at the table for that. Yeah. Because there is some slight conceptual differences.
I'm okay with service delivery model as a conceptualization, as long as we're clear that the service we're delivering is not like special education, right? Like this is not a pathway to special education. This is a means to, again, support all students effectively with the resources that we have. So, okay, I can do that.
I agree with that. It's just not always expressed in that form. So that is something we all need to talk about.
Well, we school psychologists are probably to blame for that. That probably rests firmly with us.
So in speaking of in ways to engage multiple stakeholders in RTI or MTSS implementation, Dr. Farmer, what are some strategies that can be used to engage those stakeholders in a cohesive manner, and what are some challenges that may arise when it comes to aligning the goals of different disciplines with regard to RTI?
You know, to some extent, I think this goes back to the previous question, right? When we talk about the definition of RTI, it sounded like we drifted towards what is the purpose of RTI. And I think those are inherently two different questions. And I don't know that we are consistent in differentiating those or consistent in our answers to those two questions. So when we talk about how can we involve multiple stakeholders, I think it comes down to what are the values of those stakeholders within an RTI system, what are the values of the individuals, the students going through that system, and what do they want, for lack of a better word, to get out of it, or what should they get out of it. And if we can bring it down to that sort of what do people want out of this and come at it from that perspective, it might be a little easier to have a conversation about, okay, how do we get there? And what is the general education teacher's role in getting us there? What is the school psychologist's role in getting us there? What is the administrator's role? What is the speech pathologist's role in getting us to this point where we all agree we need to be? Ultimately, it comes down to ensuring that we're all on the same page. And I think that as folks have just said, I don't think we're consistent in doing that. Both from a conceptual position and from a practical position at the local level. How can we go about doing that better? I do think finding those shared values is a big part of it. Finding those shared goals is a big part of it. Having those explicit conversations up front is a big part of it. And letting folks know, like, what up front, what is a success and what is a failure? What will we consider to be progress? What will we not consider to be progress? And having those very explicit conversations at the beginning. That's best I can answer that question, I think.
Great, thank you. Dr. Runge.
In addition to what was just described, I get the sense, again, based upon the audience, that we have a fair number of practitioners. So I'm going to come at this response from a practitioner perspective, not that my colleagues up here didn't do that. But maybe just to add a little bit more of the piece to this would be capitalizing upon the expertise of the various stakeholder groups. When I was a practitioner as a school psychologist, before MTSS was really a thing, that dates me a little bit, I was really tired of just giving IQ achievement discrepancy tests and then, like looking at data and testing large quantities of kids that frankly weren't receiving any sort of interventions. My SLP colleague, dear friend of mine, was also desiring to get out into the classroom to start doing small group intervention. And frankly, she and I were working with many of the same kids, right? Mm-hmm. And so we found a coalition of the willing teachers, primarily kindergarten, first grade teachers, who were open to us coming into their classroom and providing what we would now consider kind of tier 2 interventions. I just didn't want to test kids all the time. And I'm pretty sure that Jan Caldron didn't want to be doing individual therapy all the time and wanted to do some preventative work. And therefore, we found a couple of teachers who were willing to let us come into the classroom. Jan took what we would kind of consider more kids needing tier 2 supports, and I took the kids that I knew I was going to eventually test anyway for special education eligibility, so I might as well get to know them now in the classroom, in their natural environment. And we were delivering standard protocol interventions in phonemic awareness and early literacy. The point here is find people that are stakeholders that have particular skills, or in our case also like the building principal who didn't question why I was going to the classroom all the time, or my director of special education who basically said, as long as you're getting your evaluations done, I don't care what else you're doing. And therefore having the support to really, because they're the people that kind of controlled what we did. So you need obviously expertise from various stakeholder groups and those individuals to play a critical role. It takes everybody, not just one or two individuals, not just a school psych or not just an SLP, or it has to be everybody, because collectively all of our various domains of expertise will combine together to make a well-functioning MTSS system. So I think that's what you can do, as well as capitalize upon the various expertise that are in your buildings.
Thank you very much. And having just left a school district working as a school psychologist and coming to Patton, it's really important for those making the systemic decisions within a school building to leverage the expertise of all of these multidisciplinary perspectives, because as Dr. Runge said, I was oftentimes very busy completing evaluations. I wanted to be involved, but we needed to find ways for me to have a broader role. So with that, how can this multidisciplinary perspective that we're talking about promote the success of RTI? And how can a multidisciplinary perspective make RTI a success specifically for diverse student populations? Dr. Karuder?
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Beth. So I'm going to kind of deviate from what I was initially thinking, but I'll kind of go through a little bit of a case study and how different perspectives are needed in that process. So let's say, and I've shared, I work on the math initiative, and let's say we have a student who's maybe experiencing some math challenges and behavioral challenges. And, we want to have a good, strong system in place to support that student. So, we need the general education, the regular education teacher's perspective with regard to what does that instruction look like in core, what is happening in core. We need that perspective. Then if we're lucky enough to have someone that provides math intervention, we need that individual's perspective on what does that intervention look like, how is that happening, what are the data showing, how is the student responding to that intervention. Then having someone on the team with assessment and behavioral expertise as well, maybe looking at the function of those behaviors. Are we seeing behaviors due to academic deficits, or are they, kind of different behaviors happening somewhere else? So having that school psychologist, school counselor perspective on there. Then also having that administrator, I know there's a number of administrators in the room, having those administrative perspectives. Do we have the resources to allocate to provide the student with the supports that they need? There's not one person in this scenario that kind of holds all of the answers, but really we have to be able to work together. How can we help strengthen core? How can we help problem solve around what this student, around the skills that this student needs to develop? How can we help intervene with those math skills? How can we intervene with those behaviors? So not one person holds that perspective. I'm also going to add in there the parent perspective too. That's something, we've been talking about multidisciplinary perspectives. Parents know their kids, so bringing the parent in on that process, but engaging multiple perspectives on what that student is experiencing, what that student needs, is going to be much more beneficial than kind of one person guiding the whole ship on that. And then if we look at perhaps, and I'll kind of like kick it then to Beth, if we're looking at like reading literacy, or what about a student who has some language difficulty, we need some more perspectives in there.
Okay. So I looked at this a different angle, so it's a perfect example of how we might have the same question and we all look at it from a different lens, right? So I did go also to the multi-perspective route, but I was also looking at the tools that we bring in our toolbox. So you might be wondering, why is a speech language pathologist up here talking about this? And we are one of the assessment professionals in the schools, and we are one of the intervention professionals in the schools. So we come with the perspective of what the data is looking like. What are our referral systems looking like? And we can sit at the table and say, hey guys, we're seeing a mass amount of language referrals. Maybe it's not a disability problem, maybe it's a dyslexia problem, maybe it's a community situation. We come from, and I'm going to skirt back to how I started this, but speech language pathologists have a very unique training in the fact that we are birth to earth. So that might sound a little crude, but it sticks in your head, right? So we're birth to earth. We are trained in the entire lifespan of an individual, in their speech, their language, their executive functioning, their cognition. And so many of us, when you asked me to do a 30-second bio, I froze. Because many of us have extensive bios outside of the schools. I worked 10 years across the street in acute care, diagnosing autism, diagnosing executive functioning, working with individuals. Simultaneously, we're trained in the systems that feed into your school. So we're in your early interventions. We're in your community doing those things. So outside of a sales pitch for speech pathologists, but one of the things that we do bring, all of us at this table, and I was an assistive technology specialist for about 6 years, that's one of my backgrounds as well, all of us bring to the table a toolbox. And sometimes we might look at a student and say, I'm going to use that tired analogy about the hammer, right? But we all may look at a student and say he needs, it's a nail, I need a hammer. But maybe what it is I have a screwdriver that fits one type of screw, and you have a screwdriver that fits another type of screw. And we need to talk together about what the screw is in front of us. Not that, I'm a parent, so I would really probably be offended if my child was referred to as a screw, but it's true. He is a little screwy. But it is true, right? So one of the things that multidisciplinary approach brings is that multiple perspectives. And all of us in the room, even if we have the same training, have diverse perspectives. And the second part of that question is, how does this apply to diverse students? And so a speech language pathologist, you may be a classroom teacher, and you're working with a student who English is their second language, and you're looking at interventions for phonemic awareness. A speech language pathologist may be able to help you to figure out why they're saying pat every single time you say bat. Or they're not producing the TH sound, not because of articulation, but maybe it's not present in their language. So all of us on here are especially trained in differences versus disorder. And that idea that we need to have those conversations. Is this a difference? Pull in our ELL specialist into the conversation as well. So my long-winded speech pathologist answer is, we all come with our different toolbox, and it helps.
Very, very well said. And in the panel discussion prior to this, I did a sales pitch for SLPs too, and said in my experience when we were developing our MTSS framework in the district that I came from before Patton, one of the first things that we did was get our SLPs on our data analysis team, and we really leveraged their area of expertise, and we informed classroom teachers and special educators how much knowledge SLPs have, as well as school psychologists. I'll give a little plug for that as well. Okay, so moving on, we are going to move into a series of questions focusing on how universal design for learning can be understood as a multidisciplinary framework to meet the needs of all learners. Equitable practices will also be considered in this conversation. Dr. Eddie Byrne, we know that you are an expert in this area, so to start us off, if you can provide a brief explanation of universal design for learning, that would be wonderful.
I'll take the floor. Universal design, it has a couple different names, which also leads to some confusion. Primarily, it's known as universal design for learning, and people that use that phrase are typically affiliated with the organization in Boston called CAST. And there's a Canadian researcher that has studied this and said that CAST has gone through 5 phases of redefining what it means. So it's a little problematic about when you're looking at it, but almost everybody in the world does point to that. But there's a significant pushback in some parts of the world where we don't want to be affiliated with an organization, that one group can't own the term. So then we see the generic universal design, and I'll talk about the origins of that really in a second in terms of the building community. But then there's also a bigger umbrella called universal design in education, which then we think nobody actually owns that, but it allows for multiple viewpoints. Historically, the origins of universal design came in architecture, and the insight that developed this movement is that it was cheaper and we had better aesthetics. So going back to the resource question, that it costs less. If we design for special needs when we build, and any of you that are dealing with aging parents, one of the things we know is that if I help my parents build a new house, we can plan for kitchen and bathrooms to have wider doors. And it costs minimally to make those design modifications before we put up walls and doorways. However, if you're in a situation where mom and dad are wanting to age in place, there's quite a payment due to rehab the house, because grandma is in a wheelchair now, and when the door is too narrow. She can't get into the bathroom and the bedroom and stuff. So that insight really kind of turned around the home remodeling industry. So they were the original drivers of universal design, that it's better, cheaper to do it on the front end. Now, we had these smart people at CAST that, I don't know who was having a home remodeled where they discovered this, or if they were sitting next to somebody on a flight, where like, what do you do? And, but the paradigm shift that happened, and CAST gets credit for this, is to say, hey, let's do this in education. Now, they didn't think of that randomly. What was happening in education in the 1990s is that students with disabilities got access to the gated community called general ed. All of a sudden, they got in the general ed classrooms, and we weren't prepared. Because all these years we've been fighting, but the inclusion education movement had been growing. U.S. Department of Education supported this to say, yes, to achieve high standards, we want you in the mainstream science class, so you can have grade level challenge. Well, the reality is, before universal design for learning is, nobody recognized those kids. I'll give you the textbook. Sorry, you can't read it, that's your fault. Let's send you down to the resource room and somebody will read it to you. So this notion of universal design, to say it's not the children that are handicapped, it's the curriculum, holy cow. So universal design was adopted as a policy initiative, top down, without evidence that it worked. Okay, it's just we wanted inclusion to work, and look what we've got. So the origins of the literature will be in the 1990s and early 2000s, where you can trace that to say we're getting access to the general curriculum. Now again, a definition, a short definition. I worked with CAST, I'm not affiliated with CAST, so I don't always buy into some of their definitions, but I would argue that one of the things that's been diluted over the years is that I have to know you before I can figure out how to do UDL. And I will argue, just like the architect doesn't necessarily know the residents, I can design. So I will argue that universal design is an intervention before you ever come in the door. So let me ask you, does anybody work with kids that don't read at grade level? Okay, so if you know those kids are coming in when the bell rings, why isn't this room different? Okay, so that led to digital textbooks, digital access to things, accessible educational materials. So the goal and the potential of UDL is easy to get. Just a minute or two, you could say, hey, I want that. 25 years later, we're still trying to figure out how to do it. And so that's our tension, I think. So one of the best things that have advanced us to date is something called accessibility control panels. So if you need text on your screen enlarged, you go in, you turn it up, and everything gets enlarged. There's other things like on our texting on your phones. Text completion is something called word prediction that we used to have to do an assessment and get it for you and put it on your computer. Well, now we all use it and we think, well, that's not assistive technology. That's I use that. That can't be for somebody else. But actually, that's one of the things that kept universal design is the technology industry understood that if I build these into every device, you just have to turn it on. And actually, that's a training challenge, is that a lot of accessibility things are already there. Can I teach you to turn it on? So anyway, again, a long-winded answer, but that gives you the history, kind of where we're at, and I'll throw it open to anybody who wants to add anything.
That was perfect. Yes, thank you. Now that we have a nice history and an explanation of where UDL came from, we would like to jump into a question regarding future directions of UDL. So what are some examples of future directions for UDL, and how can incorporating multiple disciplines help achieve these future directions? Dr. Runge?
I think actually Dr. already responded to this question, maybe not necessarily on purpose, but I believe he did, and I certainly appreciate the history of UDL. I admittedly did not know it came from architecture. So once again, education stealing something from another discipline, right? We stole MTSS from the public health model, right? So anyhow, PBIS similarly as well. But I believe I just heard you say a few moments ago, essentially we've known some of these practices for 20, 25 years, but we're still struggling to get them installed. So I would respond to this question about what are future directions to actually install the practices that we know work. And that's not a very earth-shattering comment, but I mean, literally, so moving away from some of your really eloquent AT, assistive technology examples, just like opportunities to respond. We know that the more times I practice how to ride a bike, the better I am at riding a bike. The more opportunities we give kids to try reading and doing math and writing, then the better they're going to get. Obviously, we need systematic explicit instruction with corrective feedback and so forth. So it's not just simply saying, go ahead and write, and they'll magically figure it out. But we have to give them opportunities to respond. With regard to writing, very little explicit systematic instruction occurs in writing, so let's give them that. The literature is very, very clear. And therefore, I guess to respond to this, I would simply say, we already have a large body of evidence as to what works for all kids, whether it was designed through the lens of this is going to be supportive for students with special needs or not. We already have all these technologies and all these practices. Let's start doing them, because in many contexts, we're not.
Thank you. Would anyone like to elaborate regarding the specific techniques that should be used to enhance success and cohesiveness of UDL from a multidisciplinary approach? Elaborate.
I'll go first, I guess. I think that issue of that we do know things. There's many fronts that this is happening on. One is the aging market. So this notion of allowing you to stay in your home and age in place allows you to be more independent. It is more cost effective than sending you to a residential facility. So these opportunities to say, okay, you don't have to be special, this is good for everybody. I think that's the other piece, is that the value of inclusion is hopefully that differences are ordinary. Okay, you do it this way, I do it that way. I like to use the example of like getting directions. People of a certain age would call AAA and say, hey, send me some directions. I have to go up to Hershey, and can you give me the turn by turn? And other people would use that, what was it called, MapQuest, and you print it out, and you'd have it in the car. And of course, Grandpa would reach to the glove box to get a map, and then unfold it and all that kind of stuff. And then you look at our children that just get in the car and turn the GPS on. It was like, what is this? So what technology has done is it made more ways possible. And the issue is, which way is preferred? And you've heard this pushback. It's like, well, what are you going to do when the power goes out and your cell phone's not charged? How will you know how to get to Grandma's house? I won't, right? So the drawback here, and so we've not really recognized what is the role of technology and support. And we don't want people to be too dependent. Well, that's also, when we talked earlier about equity, that's also an informal way of discrimination, is that I control the power. I've got the privilege. I'm the instructor, and I can tell you, you can't do it that way. What is that about? It's about lining you up in a line 1 to 100, and those of you in the 90 to 100 to get extra credit because you're down here. And those of us at the 5 percentile level, we don't want you changing your place in line. So we might as well tattoo that right on my forehead, right? And that's the reason we do formal tests, right? Certify, that's your place. And so there is a lot of political pushback here that we don't want an equal level playing field. What? Okay, what are the social costs of leaving school without the skills we say you need, right? Well, there's some people that don't want to answer that question. So again, even though we have the tools, there's some attitudinal barriers that again, privilege allows me to say, I like things the way they are. The status quo is really good for us at the top of the line. Let's not get mixed up down here. And often when I'm doing a teacher level in-service, you'll get those hands, yeah, but. And it's that notion here that, I'm the college prep, I'm AP class, and I don't want to be confused with those kids. Yikes. I think that's a bigger problem about the future. And so if we can't make differences ordinary to say there's lots of ways to do this, you find one, we failed in terms of the purpose of education to prepare you for a lifetime, because you can't do it in school, you can't do it anywhere else. I can't read becomes I can't learn. Folks, I don't know of a more damning outcome of schooling to say I don't like science. Where did that come from? Well, I can't read, so I'm not doing science, so therefore I can't do science. Huh. So anyway, I think it goes back. There's plenty of work to do.
Anyone else elaborate from your perspective?
I think the only thing I'm just going to reiterate and mic drop what you just said about difference is normal. And there's a continuum. And from a speech language pathologist standpoint and a UDL person standpoint, difference is normal. And so we need to check our own biases when we decide that it's not. And that's what you were saying, and I just wanted to reiterate it because as a parent and as an SLP, that hit my heart really hard.
Thank you. So we've talked a bit about multidisciplinary perspectives with regard to RTI as well as UDL. So we'll focus on how educators can approach RTI and UDL in a way that promotes their intersection. Back to Dr. Eddie Byrne. How can RTI and UDL be integrated to create a cohesive and inclusive approach to educating all students? And what are some examples of shared goals or ideas that can help to enable their intersection?
A couple ideas I shared in my session today. One is the notion of, I think we have to talk about diversity blueprints. What is the range of diversity in my classroom? And then that becomes, just like the architect, a design document to say, okay, if we've got students that can't read, how do I make sure the text in the curriculum talks, or the text is multilingual for my ELL learners? Next, I think we have to talk about our toolkits being design interventions. And my school psychologist colleagues here have noticed the issue about progress monitoring and assessment. Is if it doesn't work, that's a data point, what do you got tomorrow? Okay, because it's not acceptable to say, oh, I'm sorry, you can't do it, we got to go on. If school is about these things you have to learn, then we got to figure this out. And we talked this morning about a J curve, that we've got to let go of these historical practices that are not getting us, but a normal curve is about sorting, and that I want to put an F on some of your performances and give some of the people down here at the top of the line gold stars. That is not the economy we need for the future, and that's not the investment in lifelong learning that you need to emotionally scar you in fourth grade to say, I don't do science. Really? It would have been better to skip that than to let you go through life saying, I don't do science. So I think part of our challenge is letting go of what is inappropriate or research has shown as wrong pedagogy. So let me ask you, is anybody, if you have young children or if you know a niece or nephew or neighbor, does anybody know what a balance bike is? Yeah. Can you shout it out what a balance bike is? Okay, it's a little tiny bike without pedals. Okay, so here's what the research found. Some dad was wondering why his kid couldn't ride his bike because they bought training wheels, right? And you ride around the training wheels, you think you're a Hot Wheel in the neighborhood, and then we take the training wheels off, and what happens? You fall over. The training wheels have nothing to do with riding your bike. So there's all these tears and skinned knees and parents feeling bad, well, my son can't ride yet. Well, he reanalyzed the problem, and what he found is it's not the training wheels, it's balance. So a balance bike is a little trike with no pedals. The way it stands up is you go from foot to foot. You kind of walk and then you balance and you do things. And so it's that notion of independence and balance that teaches you to ride. So what happens is the transfer then to a bike with pedals is almost errorless. Okay? Parents are just blown away. Because grandma's going to go buy that old tricycle or the old training wheel bike for you, and the hip parents are going to say, no, stop, we got to get one of these. And so I think that's a really good metaphor of how we have to let go of some of these historical things about how we think people learn and how they learn best. And again, that's a technology insight, and so I think that's the piece we want to play with technology and figure out what is the psychology of learning that changes what we do. So I'm very hopeful about that.
Thank you. I see you writing a couple of things down, Mrs.
That's for
Christopher.
later.
It's for later? Okay. Would anyone like to elaborate upon that then? No? Okay. I suspect the last question might take a little while because it's very comprehensive and about multidisciplinary perspectives again. So how can school professionals such as SLPs, school psychologists, general education teachers, special education teachers, and administrators, which is what this room, it sounds like it makes up of, and school counselors as well, how can they collaborate to ensure that UDL and RTI are implemented cohesively and with fidelity? So I think we'll start with Mrs. Christopher to talk about it from the SLP standpoint.
So I went on my soapbox, so you heard that already, but I think that the collaboration piece is essential. So it starts for me at getting every member at the table. So Dr. Runge said, tons of evals, and he made a perfect example of him working together with his speech pathologist. Getting speech pathologists to the table is really essential in looking at data. From the perspective of both UDL, RTI, MTSS, what's working in your schools. We've done such a great job at looking at data on some components of reading, but sometimes we forget the oral language component of reading. So getting a speech pathologist at the table to talk about the continuum of normal, because there is a continuum of language development. And then I was hoping to kind of dovetail off of what was said, but another thing I would say in the practical piece, right? So you're probably sitting there going, yeah, it would be great, but I have a caseload, or I have 1 million evaluations, or I can't get to every room. We need to sit down as a system and look at our data together and say, when am I best used? And looking at that data in maybe the initial stages before it becomes a referral, that then I have a huge caseload, right? If I'm looking at a school with 40% speech and language impairments, that's a data point that tells me how my curriculum needs to change, or what I need to focus on in Tier 1 and Tier 2 to support that a little bit. And so in the practical piece, back to everybody bringing their own toolkit, is I was thinking about how's this work, and up here, just us talking, I'm coming up with ideas in my head of how I'd like to work with Erica better, or how I'd like to work.
Please share them with us.
No. But I was just thinking to myself, like, a case study. Like, what's the practical thing to get people talking? Have a case study and have everyone target it from their lens and talk about that. So again, these questions can go a million different ways in my brain, but analysis together will really help to bring that skill set. Like, hey, I'm bringing this to the table. I think we need to do more of this, or to the UDL lens of it, I'm seeing a lot of people be referred for this reason. Why can't we have lined paper in all of our classrooms? Or why can't we, data or task analyze what is the point of math in a case where it's writing, and take the writing component out for a second and see what it is. So that multidisciplinary approach will have that multiple perspective and that diversity come to the table. So I'm going to throw it to you, and then I might counter.
Some of what I would planning on saying I've said earlier, and that is in regard to making sure that everybody is capitalizing upon their expertise that they bring to the implementation of MTSS, RTI, UDL. And therefore, I'm not going to necessarily repeat that in great depth. But what I would suggest to you is think about, I don't know if it was this session or the early one, Drew noted that school psychologists, for example, SLPs as well, some of our other allied support staff, have training in a broad variety of skills, but then typically in most school systems that are dysfunctional, they're doing one thing. And by the way, that's a fast track for burnout for most of those professionals as well. Yet at the same time, and this is what I'm always struck by, at the same time we're asking teachers to do more and more and more. I don't understand why we can't build systems and frameworks that permit the other professionals in a school building to do more of what they were trained to do, to take off the load, at least some of the load that teachers are bearing on an everyday basis. Such as, why can't a school psychologist be involved in direct intervention? I mean, we're trained to do that. Why don't we? Well, we can put our test kits down and work with kids directly, whether it's through social emotional kind of interventions or academic interventions. School counselors, likewise. I'm married to a school counselor, so of course I'm going to advocate for school counselors doing more than what they're typically doing, which is, at least in some of the contexts in which I've worked, they're processing a lot of paperwork, and especially as it relates to end of the year testing and so forth. Well, they've got so much more training that they could offer if the system was designed to free them a little bit to do other things. And what that does mean, however, is that initially when you're starting to do this work, all of the professionals are going to have to work a little bit harder, but you have to look at the long game. For me, the long game was a couple of different foci. One was, I'm going to probably end up evaluating these kids anyway, so I might as well learn who they are in their national context, and I'll get some data along the way in terms of how well did they respond to my ladders to literacy implementation frameworks within those classrooms. So I could do that. Now that required me working a little bit harder, and same with the SLP. I'm sure she wasn't just sitting around eating bonbons every day waiting for kids to come down to into her room, but she willingly went out into the classrooms because we both saw the long-term vision here, which was to reduce referrals for special education, reduce the need for highly expensive and intensive intervention services that may or may not work despite our best efforts, and instead do a lot of that preventative work. And again, from an administrator perspective, support your staff in doing that. So if there are ways to reduce the quote-unquote unnecessary referrals for SLPs or school psychs, you know, those referrals where everybody knows the kid already is doing well in school, so why are we testing this kid for special ed? Don't tell me, school psychs, that you don't have a few of those. You do, right? So how can we legally prevent those from hitting our desk, which thus frees up our time? I say that legally just to make sure that we're not denying FAPE and child fine obligations, just to be crystal clear since this is being recorded. But there are things that we can do if you kind of look at the long-term vision. And so at least from my perspective, in addition to what has already been expressed, I think that's what we have to do is collectively together, given everybody's various expertise and the toolboxes that they bring, look at the long-term vision. It's going to be bumpy and awkward and ugly, and it may not work very well early on, but stick with it. We know from systems level change work that it takes 3 to 5 years to get kind of an entire school system functioning in a different direction. So you're not going to see immediate benefits, but hold fast to that work because you will eventually see those benefits. You just have to stick to it.
I'm going to jump in here really quick and ask the room, how many of you are overburdened? How many of you are doing things that you know don't work, but you're required to do them anyway? Right. So if we want to talk about how we can get UDL and RTI to work, we need to be talking about how we can remove some of these, let's go with vestigial practices, for lack of a better word, these practices that were put in with very good intention at some point in time, but have either lost their meaning entirely or never really worked but weren't removed. Classroom management is a good example of this, right? We talked a little bit earlier about how do we deal with a classroom when we have all of these different kids in one classroom who are triggering for evals. We have classroom management issues, and we can look at getting school-wide implementation. We can get additional trainings. We can roll out behavior management plans to these classrooms. That's a lot of work. And I heard today from some folks, they've rolled out zones of regulation to a lot of classrooms. There's no evidence for that program. Like literally no studies have shown that it works. So why are we rolling that out knowing good well that in a couple of years we're going to have to replace it with the next fad? And of course, there's a 50-50 shot that that'll work. Or we could go with one of the things that we already have that do. And, this goes back to some of the points made along the panel today is lean on the folks you have. Lean on the expertise of the professionals in the building who specialize in these things. These folks have a very strong background in classroom management and what works in behavioral intervention. We are able to pull from what already exists, and often it's a lot cheaper. If we could do fewer things and get more benefit, we would have more space in our day, one, to breathe, because we all deserve to breathe, and two, to do what works for the maximal benefit of the students in our classes. I think that failing to recognize that we have just so much baggage, and I'm talking about every profession in this room, so much baggage of things that don't matter, things that don't help the student we're working with, that it is nearly impossible to even conceive of adding the next new evidence-based instructional strategy or evidence-based practice to our toolbox. We can talk about toolboxes all day, but our toolboxes are overflowing with tape measures in metrics we don't even consider. So until we're reasonably and realistically at the systems level talking about reducing our workloads of unnecessary and potentially harmful things, I don't think we can talk about successful implementation of RTI.
And, I think it's clear that we're all passionate advocates for multidisciplinary perspectives and inclusion of all of our areas of expertise to form a cohesive RTI framework. And so RTI, MTSS, and UDL can interconnect. Advocacy, obviously, is an important part of this. But who ultimately would you say is responsible for translating that vision into action within school systems?
I'm going to jump in and say that's, oh God, leadership, right? Like, ultimately, you can have great people who are skilled and can do things and everything like that, but if you're constrained by the available resources, by your schedule, by everything like that, like, you can't get these things done. Like, if you're not getting release time, right? I used to say this, so I worked at Patton a little bit, and before I went to Miller for just a bit, sorry. Like, and I would talk to sites who were trying to implement RTI and MTSS, and I'd be like, if you're going to do this, you need to devote FTE to it, right? You can't take people who are already up to their eyeballs and stuff to do and be like, hey, why don't you be a data analyst on top of it? And we're going to book our reading specialists. They're doing interventions nonstop all day, which should signal a systems level problem right there, right? And we're going to expect them to progress monitor and analyze data, but we're not accounting any time in their day for that, right? We have no FTE accounted for collaboration and meetings. Like, if these things are priorities, then they have to be part of people's schedules and people's workload. And that comes back to leadership and implementation drivers of that sort. And I feel like I had something else I wanted to say, but it's gone from my mind, so.
That's all right. I'll jump in real quick. So I also think kind of leadership, but having that leadership team at the building level, representative, so that people's voices are heard, that oversees that infrastructure. But kind of thinking about like some of the earlier sessions we had today, taking away things that don't work. Often we're like, we meet to death. And one of the tools that's really helpful, it's the Working Smarter Matrix, but basically it's a teaming audit. And so not just practices like, DARE or Red Ribbon Week or whatever that might be that take a lot of energy, but we really don't get a big bang for our buck, or maybe, even get not great outcomes from it. Think about all of those different teams in your building and doing an audit. Are there teams that have overlapping responsibilities and people are kind of meeting to death with those? Do that teaming audit. Who's on the team? What's the function? What are those outcomes of the team? Are there even any outcomes for that team? just might be another area to kind of start. And leaders are an important part of that teaming structure. But I want to say George Suga, I like the teaming structure, working smarter matrix. Audit all your teams. What are they doing? What are those outcomes of those team meetings? Because they might be tied to some of those practices.
The comments about giving up ineffective practices and the importance of leadership, I'd like to bring us down in terms of a scary story after Halloween. I'm not sure how many people are paying much attention to the whole issue of AI, but recently did a full-day workshop on this. But here's one of the issues that the futurists tell us, is the future is not going to be like the past. So during this period of rapid change, what we tend to do is look backwards and think, oh, if we just made this 2019 or 1970, education would be so good. So one of the problems here, if you've not heard of the book, The Future of Work, I'd really recommend it because they have several case studies, and one of which is how the accounting field was decimated by TurboTax. And the crying wolf in the field is they're coming for white-collar jobs. And what's been happening since last November when ChatGPT has been released is this is supposed to be 30 years out. And the futurists are pretty scared right now that this may be 3 to 5 years. And the issue is the accountants filled in forms. If it's predictable, I can have a machine do it. Now, it's not going to be good initially, but the issue here is school psychologists are a target because we give assessments and we score them. We can teach a machine to do that. Again, it won't be good, but that's it. Again, what we saw during the pandemic is we adopted one-to-one device. Every kid has a device. We adopted digital curriculum. Now, we don't have learning pathways. We don't have remediation algorithms that help kids. So I basically say wrong, 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 wrong. Okay, so it's not where it needs to be. But if we learn some of those things, those systems are going to get smarter. But now if we add the problem of retaining teachers, okay, we've got the perfect storm for the next Amazon to be a digital curriculum in Starbucks. Okay, you drop your kids off at Starbucks with their little credit card. They get food and water throughout the day. It's a safe environment. They go over to the little cubicle and they do their 3 hours of classroom work. It scores them, and then they're free to go work in the afternoon. Did you hear about one school that's releasing kids to go? We're lowering the child labor laws so that you can be employed at 12. Look what just happened. We're going to boost our economy by taking kids out of school and make them employees. We're going to get rid of teachers because we're going to automate it. Okay, now I totally hope I'm wrong. I'm a technology advocate, but I don't like the way my crystal ball's working this afternoon. But I want to tell you something about that to give the smart people in the room to collaborate, that the future of all this may implode because of all these external factors. And what I'm seeing in here, I had a gentleman come up to me this morning. He said another half of his staff is going to resign at the end of this year. I'm like, and he goes, he doesn't even know who's running his class this week while he's gone. So anyway, I just want to throw this out there because the future warning I'm sharing for Halloween is the future could be very different than the past. And so we can talk about some of these things. We need some people at the table, and typically education's not at the AI table. It's too technical. Right. So anyway, I want to share that with you as a warning to think about, but it's just, and I don't know what we do. I mean, it just scares me to death. So with that, I'll stop talking.
Please.
I have to say, again, from my lens, it's the full person I am, a parent and a speech pathologist and an educational consultant. I have to go, your scary story made me very sick, and as a parent of a second grader. But also, to your point, those two stories need to come together. Those need thoughts in analyzing what works. Because the one-to-one sometimes doesn't work in what we're looking for in that task analysis of, for handwriting, Seesaw's not the best thing from a parent perspective. It hasn't worked. Vocabulary cards maybe isn't what a speech and language. So your scary story is true, it's coming. But we also need to build our systems to data analyze now and take those things off so we're prepared to look at what actually works for us.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time. We have about 4 minutes. Are there any questions from the audience or any comments even for our expert panel of speakers? No? I know there were some questions at the end of the last panel, and we had to wrap up. So even if, the two panels were interrelated, we've talked a lot about multidisciplinary perspectives with regard to RTI in both. So if you have any lingering questions from the last panel as well, please feel free. Or any concluding thoughts from our panelists? It's been a long afternoon. No? Okay.
Can I give a shameless
Sure.
plug?
Absolutely.
So I'm a big Car Talk fan, so here's my shameless plug. If you're a supervisor out there and you're wondering how a speech pathologist could be better, employed, we have a network, meetings, right? More meetings, but we do try to keep them short and sweet and to the point. But we do have we do have a network at Patton of supervisors and administrators who work with speech and language pathologists and programs, and we would encourage you to come and talk through, and together we problem solve. It's only an hour, and we do our best to keep it short and sweet and to the point.
Thank you. All right, well, let's give a round of applause for our panelists.